Imagine taking a bite of an ordinary piece of bread and discovering that the longer you chew it, the sweeter it begins to taste. There is no spoonful of sugar hidden inside it, no frosting, no syrup. Yet after a few moments, that bland mouthful can become surprisingly sweet. That simple experience reveals something most people never learn about carbohydrates. Sugar does not always arrive on your plate looking like sugar. Sometimes it is packaged inside starch, and your digestive system is remarkably good at breaking that starch down. Once you understand that, the question changes. Instead of asking whether a food contains sugar, you have to ask what that food does after you eat it. And that leads to a much more useful question. If carbohydrates make up such a large part of the modern diet, which ones are least likely to create problems for your blood sugar, insulin, appetite, and long-term metabolic health? For years, carbohydrates have been placed into one giant category. Bread is a carbohydrate. Rice is a carbohydrate. Potatoes are carbohydrates. Fruit is a carbohydrate. Beans are carbohydrates. Broccoli is a carbohydrate. From a nutrition label, that may be technically true, but it tells you almost nothing about how these foods behave inside the body. Two foods can both be called carbohydrates while producing very different physiological effects. One may deliver a large amount of rapidly available glucose with very little fiber. Another may contain mostly water and fiber, with only a small amount of digestible carbohydrate. Treating both foods as if they were identical is one of the reasons nutrition advice becomes so confusing. The real story is not simply carbohydrates versus no carbohydrates. The real story is what kind of carbohydrate you are eating, how much of it is digestible, how quickly it becomes available, and what the rest of the food does to slow or alter that process. There are three broad forms that help make this easier to understand: sugars, starches, and fiber. Sugars are the simplest forms of carbohydrate and can be absorbed relatively quickly. Starches are different because they are long chains of glucose molecules linked together. During digestion, your body breaks those chains apart, eventually releasing glucose that can enter the bloodstream. Fiber is different again. Much of the fiber found in plant foods resists digestion in the small intestine. Instead of being rapidly converted into glucose and absorbed, certain types of fiber travel farther through the digestive tract, where gut microorganisms can use them as fuel. That distinction is extremely important because it means not every carbohydrate-containing food behaves like a bowl of sugar. Think back to that piece of bread. The sweetness you eventually notice is not proof that the bread is literally turning into table sugar inside your mouth. It is a simple demonstration of digestion beginning right where you are chewing. Enzymes in saliva begin breaking down starch into smaller carbohydrate molecules, including maltose and other sugars. The longer you chew, the more opportunity those enzymes have to work. Your mouth is essentially giving you a tiny preview of what digestion will continue doing farther down the digestive tract. The lesson is simple. A food does not need to taste sweet to contain a substantial amount of carbohydrate that can eventually contribute to your blood glucose. Now consider what happens after that carbohydrate reaches the bloodstream. Your body does not simply allow glucose to remain there indefinitely. The pancreas responds by releasing insulin, a hormone that helps regulate blood glucose and assist tissues in taking up and storing energy. Muscle is particularly important because skeletal muscle can store glucose in the form of glycogen and use it as fuel. When insulin is working effectively, the body is generally able to handle carbohydrate more efficiently. But the picture changes when tissues become less responsive to insulin. This condition is commonly described as insulin resistance, and it is associated with a cluster of metabolic problems that can include elevated blood sugar, increased abdominal fat, fatty liver disease, abnormal blood lipids, and a greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes. This is one reason two people can eat similar meals and experience very different outcomes over time. One person may have good insulin sensitivity, regular physical activity, healthy muscle mass, and a relatively balanced diet. Another may spend most of the day sitting, sleep poorly, carry substantial visceral fat, and regularly consume highly processed foods. The carbohydrate itself is only one piece of the equation. The condition of the entire metabolic system matters. That is why saying carbs are good or carbs are bad is far too simplistic to be useful. There is a measurement called the glycemic index that can help explain part of this difference. It estimates how quickly a carbohydrate-containing food raises blood glucose compared with a reference food. Foods with a higher glycemic index tend to produce a faster rise in blood glucose, while foods with a lower glycemic index generally produce a slower response. But even this measurement has limitations. The glycemic index does not tell you how much carbohydrate you actually eat. A food can have a relatively high glycemic index, but be consumed in a small portion, while another food may have a lower index and be eaten in a much larger quantity. The total amount of carbohydrate, the amount of fiber, the degree of processing, the presence of protein and fat, and the overall meal can all influence the real-world glucose response. Processing can make a major difference. Take an intact grain and compare it with a highly refined powder made from that grain. The original food has a physical structure that can take more time to break apart. Grinding, milling, cooking, and other forms of processing can change how quickly digestive enzymes gain access to starch. The result can be a faster release of glucose. This is one reason a bowl of minimally processed whole grains is not metabolically identical to a highly refined flour product made from the same original plant. The same principle applies to potatoes. A whole potato contains starch, but its effect can vary depending on the variety, preparation method, cooking, cooling, portion size, and what else is eaten with it. Rice can vary for similar reasons. Some varieties and cooking methods can produce a faster glucose response than others. None of this means a person has to fear every grain or every starchy vegetable. It means the word carbohydrate alone does not provide enough information to make a good nutritional decision. Now compare those foods with something like broccoli, spinach, cauliflower, cabbage, zucchini, cucumber, or leafy greens. These foods contain carbohydrates, but much of their volume comes from water and fiber rather than concentrated starch. That changes the equation dramatically. You can eat a substantial portion of many non-starchy vegetables without consuming the amount of digestible carbohydrate found in an equivalent size serving of bread, pasta, rice, or potatoes. They also bring something refined carbohydrate products often lack: a broad collection of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, and other plant compounds. This is where the idea of a safe carbohydrate becomes more useful. If by safe we mean a carbohydrate-containing food that is generally nutrient-dense, high in fiber, relatively low in digestible carbohydrate, and unlikely to produce a large glucose load when eaten as part of a balanced meal, non-starchy vegetables are among the strongest choices. They are not magic foods. They do not erase diabetes. They do not make an unhealthy diet healthy by themselves. But they can provide a tremendous amount of nutritional value for relatively little, rapidly available carbohydrate. And there is another reason vegetables deserve attention. Fiber does not simply pass through the body without a purpose. Certain types of fiber reach the colon, where gut bacteria ferment them and produce short-chain fatty acids such as acetate, propionate, and butyrate. These compounds interact with the intestinal environment and may influence metabolism, immune function, and appetite regulation. Some fibers can also influence pathways involved in satiety, including pathways related to GLP-1. This does not mean eating broccoli produces the same effect as a prescription GLP-1 medication. It does not. But it does illustrate why the structure of whole plant foods matters. The body is not merely receiving calories. It is interacting with a complex mixture of nutrients and compounds. Vegetables also provide important minerals. Potassium plays a major role in nerve signaling, muscle contraction, and fluid balance. Magnesium participates in hundreds of biochemical reactions, including processes related to energy metabolism and glucose regulation. Getting adequate amounts of these nutrients through a varied diet is one reason a plate built around whole foods can look very different from the diet dominated by refined starches. There is another major factor that changes how the body handles carbohydrates: muscle. Think of your skeletal muscles as one of the body's largest storage sites for glucose. When you move, especially when you perform resistance exercise, your muscles need energy. Regular physical activity improves the ability of muscle tissue to take up glucose and can improve insulin sensitivity. You do not have to become a bodybuilder to benefit. Walking, climbing stairs, cycling, gardening, swimming, and strength training all provide opportunities to use your muscles. The opposite can happen when movement disappears. Prolonged inactivity can reduce insulin sensitivity relatively quickly. That does not mean a few days on the couch will automatically cause diabetes, but it does demonstrate how responsive metabolism is to physical activity. Your muscles are not passive tissue. They are metabolically active organs, and what you do with them influences how your body handles the energy you eat. This helps explain something that can look confusing from the outside. You may know someone who eats bread, pasta, rice, or dessert regularly and appears to have no obvious metabolic problems. Then you may know someone else who gains weight easily and develops high blood sugar despite eating what seems like a similar diet. There can be many reasons for those differences: genetics, age, activity, sleep, body composition, medications, overall calorie intake, liver health, and the presence or absence of insulin resistance. It is not useful to conclude that one person has discovered a secret carbohydrate that works for everyone else. Sleep deserves particular attention because metabolism does not operate separately from your daily rhythm. Poor or insufficient sleep can affect insulin sensitivity, appetite regulation, stress hormones, and food choices. When people are exhausted, they may crave highly palatable foods, have less energy for exercise, and find it harder to maintain consistent eating patterns. A person trying to improve metabolic health, therefore, should not focus exclusively on counting grams of carbohydrate while ignoring the hours of the day when the body is supposed to recover. Stress can also influence the picture. When the body repeatedly experiences psychological or physiological stress, hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline help prepare it to respond. Short-term stress responses are normal and useful. Chronic stress is different. It can interfere with sleep, appetite, physical activity, and glucose regulation. Again, this does not mean stress alone causes insulin resistance. Metabolic health is more complicated than that. But it is another reason the body should be viewed as an interconnected system rather than a machine reacting to one ingredient at a time. Then there is visceral fat, the fat stored around internal organs and the abdomen. This type of fat is metabolically active and is associated with insulin resistance and other cardiometabolic risk factors. As visceral fat increases, the body's ability to regulate glucose and lipids can become less favorable. This is why simply removing one category of food does not always solve the underlying problem. If insulin resistance is already present, improving the entire metabolic environment may require changes in physical activity, sleep, body composition, food quality, and overall energy intake. Fructose adds another layer to the discussion. Fructose naturally occurs in fruits, where it arrives alongside fiber, water, vitamins, minerals, and other plant compounds. That is very different from consuming large amounts of added sugar in beverages and ultra-processed foods. The liver plays a central role in fructose metabolism, and excessive intake of added sugars, particularly in liquid form, can contribute to excessive calorie intake and metabolic problems. This is not a reason to fear an apple. It is a reason to distinguish whole fruit from heavily sweetened products. A whole apple requires chewing. It contains water and fiber. It takes up physical space in your stomach and generally takes longer to consume than a sugary drink. A bottle of sweetened beverage can deliver a large amount of sugar quickly without providing the same amount of fiber or satiety. The carbohydrate category is technically the same broad category, but the physiological context is completely different. This is why food structure matters so much. Imagine taking the same plant and progressively breaking it down. First, you have the intact food. Then perhaps it is chopped, then cooked, then ground into flour, then refined into a powder, then combined with oils, sweeteners, and flavorings to create a highly processed product. Each step can alter how quickly the food is eaten, digested, absorbed, and how satisfying it feels. The further a food moves from its original structure, the more carefully you should consider what has been added and what has been removed. None of this means every processed food is automatically harmful or every whole food is automatically beneficial. Nutrition rarely works in absolute categories. But if your goal is better metabolic health, a useful foundation is surprisingly simple. Emphasize minimally processed foods, eat plenty of non-starchy vegetables, choose fiber-rich foods, include adequate protein, stay physically active, and reduce your reliance on refined carbohydrates and added sugars. Now return to the question that started all of this. What is the safest carbohydrate? If you are looking for one specific food that can magically protect you from insulin resistance, there is no such food. But if you are looking for a category of carbohydrate-containing foods that is generally nutrient-dense, high in fiber, low in digestible carbohydrate, and compatible with blood sugar-conscious eating, non-starchy vegetables are an excellent answer. Leafy greens, broccoli, cauliflower, peppers, mushrooms, zucchini, asparagus, cabbage, and many other vegetables fit naturally into that category. And notice what makes them valuable. It is not that they contain zero carbohydrate. They do not. Their advantage comes from the combination of low energy density, fiber, micronutrients, water, and plant compounds. You can build a large portion of your meal around them without creating the same carbohydrate load that would come from making refined grains the centerpiece of the plate. Consider two dinners. In the first, most of the plate is white bread, refined pasta, or another concentrated starch, with a small amount of vegetables on the side. In the second, the majority of the plate is non-starchy vegetables, accompanied by a source of protein and an appropriate amount of a minimally processed carbohydrate if desired. Those meals are not metabolically identical. The second provides more volume, more fiber, and more micronutrients, while generally delivering less rapidly available carbohydrate. This does not mean you have to eliminate bread forever. It does not mean potatoes are poisonous. It does not mean rice automatically causes diabetes. And it certainly does not mean everyone needs a very low carbohydrate diet. People have different nutritional needs, medical conditions, medications, activity levels, and cultural eating patterns. Someone with diabetes may need individualized carbohydrate guidance from a qualified clinician or registered dietitian. Someone who exercises heavily may have very different carbohydrate requirements from someone who is sedentary. The important shift is to stop asking, "Is this a carb?" and start asking better questions. How processed is it? How much fiber does it contain? How much digestible carbohydrate is in the portion? How quickly do I tend to eat it? What am I eating with it? How active am I? How does my blood glucose respond? And what does this food contribute nutritionally beyond calories? Those questions are far more useful than simply putting foods into a good versus bad list. If you are concerned about insulin resistance, do not try to diagnose yourself from one meal or one glucose reading. Talk with a healthcare professional about the appropriate test for your situation. Common measures used to assess glucose regulation include fasting blood glucose and HbA1c. And in some circumstances, other testing may be appropriate. Fasting insulin can provide additional information in certain clinical contexts. But there is no universal number that independently diagnoses everyone's metabolic health. Your results need to be interpreted alongside your medical history and other laboratory findings. And if your goal is to improve insulin sensitivity, do not make the mistake of thinking food is the only lever available. Walking after meals can increase glucose uptake by working muscles. Resistance training can help build and maintain muscle. Regular aerobic activity supports cardiovascular and metabolic health. Adequate sleep matters. Managing excess body fat can matter. Avoiding smoking matters. Keeping blood pressure and cholesterol under control matters. All of these pieces interact. One of the encouraging things about metabolic health is that the body can respond to positive changes. You do not have to transform yourself overnight. A person who has spent years eating highly processed foods does not need to become perfect tomorrow. Start by changing the environment around your meals. Put vegetables on the plate first. Keep convenient, high-fiber foods available. Replace sugary drinks with water or unsweetened beverages when appropriate. Walk more. Strengthen your muscles. Get consistent sleep. Gradually reduce the foods that make it easy to consume large amounts of refined carbohydrate without feeling satisfied. The goal is not punishment. The goal is making the healthier choice easier. And there is one final misconception worth clearing up. A food can be low in sugar and still have a major effect on blood glucose if it contains a substantial amount of digestible starch. That is why looking only at the sugar line on a nutrition label can be misleading. A product might advertise itself as having little or no added sugar while still containing a large amount of refined flour or another starch. The body does not care whether the carbohydrate arrived with a sweet taste. Digestive enzymes can still break starch down into absorbable glucose. That is exactly why the bread experiment is so memorable. You can experience the transformation happening in your mouth. A food that began as bland becomes sweeter as starch is broken down. It is a simple reminder that carbohydrate chemistry is more complicated than taste. Now imagine applying that understanding to your everyday grocery cart. Instead of asking whether the package says low sugar, look at the entire food. Is it highly refined? How much fiber is present? How much total carbohydrate is there? Is the ingredient list dominated by refined grains and added sugars? Does the food leave you satisfied, or does it make you want another serving 10 minutes later? Then look at the foods that do not require complicated calculations. A bowl of leafy greens, a serving of broccoli, roasted cauliflower, peppers, green beans, mushrooms, zucchini, cabbage. These foods are not glamorous. They are not usually marketed with dramatic promises, but they fit several basic principles of a healthy diet: nutrient density, fiber, water, and relatively low amounts of rapidly available carbohydrate. That is the real reason non-starchy vegetables stand out. They are not a miracle. They are simply difficult to beat when you want a large amount of nutrition without a large carbohydrate load. And once you understand that, the carbohydrate debate becomes much less confusing. You do not have to be afraid of every carbohydrate. You do not have to believe every carbohydrate is harmless either. You need to understand the difference between concentrated refined starch, added sugar, whole food carbohydrate, and fiber-rich plant foods. Your body is constantly responding to what you give it. Every meal sends information. A highly refined, carbohydrate-heavy meal may create a very different metabolic response from a meal built around vegetables, protein, healthy fats, and a moderate portion of minimally processed carbohydrate. Repeat those choices for years, and the cumulative effect becomes much more important than any single meal. So if you are trying to improve your metabolic health, do not begin with fear. Begin with understanding. The next time you see a food labeled carbohydrate, remember that the word alone does not tell you the whole story. Ask what kind of carbohydrate it contains. Ask how much is actually digestible. Ask whether fiber is present. Ask how processed the food is. Ask what else is on your plate. And most importantly, consider how your overall lifestyle supports the way your body handles that food. Because the healthiest carbohydrate is not necessarily the one with the lowest number on a label. It is often the carbohydrate that arrives as part of a whole, nutrient-dense food naturally packaged with fiber, water, vitamins, minerals, and plant compounds. That is why non-starchy vegetables deserve such a prominent place on the plate. Not because they are perfect, and not because they can magically prevent disease, but because they provide your body with a lot of what it needs without delivering a large, concentrated load of rapidly available carbohydrate. Once you understand that difference, you can stop fearing the word carbohydrate and start making much smarter choices. Your next meal does not have to be perfect. Just make it a little less refined, a little more fiber-rich, and a little closer to the form nature originally provided. Those small decisions repeated day after day can become much more powerful than any single diet rule.